The 2025 Scouting Combine is complete, so in this video, we're going to be doing our stock up and stock down for some of the top prospects in the 2025 NFL Draft. If you guys do go on to enjoy the video, hit the like and subscribe button. Let's hop into it. So we're going to begin by kind of just going back and forth from a player who had their stock up, and then we'll talk about a player that had their stock down. We're going to begin with our first stock up player, and that's, of course, Shamar Stewart. Shamar Stewart, ever since the season has been over with, has just been shooting up draft boards. He was somebody who was seen as a fringe first rounder, but more than likely like an early second round, somewhere along those lines, to where now this guy's basically feels like a top 20 lock, if not top 15 lock, if not potentially even a top 10 lock. He's 6'5". He weighed in at 267 pounds, which is actually a stark difference from what he weighed at Texas A&M, where he was actually a bit more like 280, 290. So he lost a little bit of weight to try to put on a better performance at the combine, and it definitely paid off. At the combine, he ran a 4.59 40-yard dash with a 10-yard split of 1.58, which is really good. A 40-inch vertical jump and a 10-foot 11-inch broad jump. This dude is just a straight up athletic freak. He showed out at the Senior Bowl. He had a really good time there. So basically, ever since the season's end, this guy has just been moving up draft boards. I know some teams or some fans out there don't love Shamar Stewart because of the lack of productivity, but if you do buy into the potential upside this player does present, then I definitely do think that this is something that you should at least consider being a good pick for your team. If your team needs defensive line help, if they need a little bit of extra juice, maybe you take on a bit more of a quote-unquote project player like Shamar Stewart, who right now maybe probably won't be, a top 5 defensive end in the first couple of years, but as time goes on, as he develops some pass rush moves, as he starts to kind of get more sacks and get a bit more productivity, you're looking at somebody who can genuinely become one of the better players in the league, in my opinion. He has all the physical tools in the toolbox. It just comes down to really unlocking it and really becoming the guy that we all think he could be. Again, he's an athletic freak, and he showed out the combine, and I'm sure a lot of teams are just foaming at the mouth to get this guy on their roster and just kind of have a clean slate to try to build this guy into what they need for their roster. Next up, we have a stock down candidate, and that's going to be, unfortunately, Tez Johnson. Tez Johnson weighed in 5'10", 154 pounds, 29 3/8 inch arms. Given the fact that he's only 150 pounds, you would want to see him run a good 40, and he ran an okay 40, but not for 150 pounds. He ran a 4.51 with a 10-yard split of 1.53, vertical jump of 37 inches, broad jump of 10 foot 11 inches, 6.65 3-cone drill, and a 4.15 20-yard shuttle. Again, I don't think he necessarily had the worst day per se, but again, when you're 150 pounds, the expectation is for you to go out there and run somewhere along the lines of like a 4.4 or a 4.3, or when you are that small and that have that frame, the expectation is that you make up for the lack of size and frame with athleticism. And while I think Tez Johnson is a lot better of an athlete than what he showed at the combine, it definitely wasn't a day that showcased his overall skill set and what he can do at the NFL level. Again, Tez Johnson was extremely productive this year for Oregon. He was arguably their #1 wide receiver with some really good players on that team. But again, 154 pounds, only 5'10", 4.51 40-yard dash, just not a really good productive day for him. Hopefully his pro day is better, because again, I think that he's actually a really fast player. You watch him on film and he goes out there and burns by dudes all the time, and for a 4.5, he looks extremely fast. So I would assume that he's going to run again at the pro day, probably run a little bit better, but this also could be a situation where Tez Johnson's just a better player on the field or in the film, more so than he is, in his, underwear essentially. But with that said, let's move on to our next stock up candidate, and this is going to be Nick Emanwori. Now, Nick Emanwori was somebody who I personally had as a potential second round pick, but I think it's pretty fair to say that Nick Emanwori might now be a borderline first round lock. On the day, he ran a 4.38 40-yard dash, a 1.49 10-yard split, a 43-inch vertical jump, a 11-foot 6-inch broad jump, and 20 reps on bench press. He's 6'3", and hear this, 220 pounds. He ranked first in athleticism score, first in production score. He ranked first in total score amongst all safeties via Next Gen Stats. This is all via the NFL website. This dude just had an absolute incredible day. Now, I do think that Nick Emanwori has a little bit of question marks whether or not he's going to be a safety long term, or is he going to move inside to be a bit more of a nickel, or more of like a borderline in the box type of guy, like a linebacker almost, because I think he has that versatility. But whatever team gets this guy, they're getting a guy who is extremely well sized, extremely productive. At South Carolina, he was very productive, while also kind of having this guy who can play multiple positions, sort of like, with Jalen Walker, where you're talking about him playing off ball linebacker as well as playing off the edge. Nick Emanwori can play a strong safety role. He can play probably a nickel nickel role, or if you want to, maybe you move him inside to play more of an inside linebacker role, maybe add on 10-15 pounds, just kind of have him be a really fast, agile linebacker that would be fantastic in coverage. So there's a lot of different things you can do with Nick Emanwori. Again, this is somebody who I had as around a second round pick, but now I'm seeing mock drafts pretty consistently have him in the first, and I would make the argument that after his combine, I will probably start putting him in more of my first round mock drafts. He's very well sized. Again, 220 pounds for a safety. That's pretty damn big. 6'3", but he was one of the fastest guys out there. Again, a 4.38 at 220 pounds. Ridiculous day for Nick Emanwori, and I'm pretty happy for him, honestly. Next stock down candidate, unfortunately, it's going to be Will Howard. Now, I want to throw this caveat out there that the dude was getting booed the entire time at the combine, which this is just my opinion. You guys can disagree or, you know, maybe agree. I personally think that the NFL should not have fans at the scouting combine. I just personally think that this is an interview for these players. They're going out there and essentially putting on as best of a film and as best of a drills as they physically can to get a job in the NFL. But there's fans in the back booing Will Howard because he went to Ohio State. Me personally, I think that's a little bit effed up because they also did the same thing to Isaiah Bond because he didn't run like a 4.21, which is just crazy. With that said, Will Howard really didn't do himself any favors. He was missing basically almost, it felt like every throw. Now, he did make a couple nice throws, but he didn't really do much of the drills. He didn't run. He didn't do anything like that. And I do think for Will Howard, maybe that would have been something that he should have done to just kind of gain a bit of a competitive edge. Even if he ran like a 4.8, I think it would have shown that he is the ultimate competitor. And for the sake of Will Howard, if you want to jump guys like Quinn Ewers and Dylan Gabriel and potentially even Jackson Dart, showing that you are that level of a competitor, I think maybe could have been a smart thing for him to do. Ultimately, that's not why he's here though. For me, he just missed a lot of throws. He didn't look as accurate as what you would want to see. Again, I do want to throw the caveat that he's throwing to guys that he's probably never thrown to before, so there's going to be some missed throws here and there, but he basically missed what felt like every throw. And compare that to guys like Jackson Dart, Quinn Ewers, who I thought had really good days and arguably maybe are a little bit ahead of Will Howard now. Again, this could be a situation where you just say, hey, go watch the film. He makes every throw. He knows how to make every single type of play. Like, this is somebody who maybe is a bit more of an in-game guy, but again, I thought at the combine, he looked a little disappointing. All right, moving on to my next stock up candidate, and it's going to be Maxwell Hairston. I thought Maxwell Hairston looked the best of all the corners throughout the day. A 4.28 40-yard dash, 1.5 10-yard split, 39.5 vertical jump, 10'9" broad jump. He ranked 7th amongst all combine cornerbacks, which I think he was arguably the best in my opinion. Now, this maybe could just be from my perspective, but based off what I've been reading around the rumors and everything like that, it does appear like Maxwell Hairston is arguably the biggest riser of all the cornerbacks, maybe outside of like Jahdae Barron, who also had himself an awesome day, but he only ran the 40 and kind of called it a day, so I didn't want to include him. By the way, shout out to Jahdae Barron and Matthew Golden, both Texas guys. I didn't put them on the list because they only ran the 40. So Maxwell Hairston, he went out there, ran the 40, did the broad jump, did the vertical jump. More importantly for me, I wanted to see how he looked in the drills, and I thought he looked pretty consistently like one of the best for each drill. He has very fluid hips. He looked like he was just natural out there. Like, everything looked so easy for him to do. Compare that to some other cornerbacks like Azariah Thomas, who I personally think is a better player than Maxwell Hairston, but Azariah Thomas had a couple drills where he looked a little bit clunky at times, didn't have as much fluidity to him as Maxwell Hairston did. And for Maxwell, who ran a 4.28, to also have very fluid hips, to move very well, to track the ball nicely, to also have really good measurables. He was 5'11", 183 pounds, which is pretty decent size for a cornerback in the league. I think you're looking at somebody who went from potentially being a late second, early third to being a bit more like potentially a late first, early second round pick. When you are as athletic as Maxwell Hairston with the production that he had in college, while also having a really good field day, if he has a good pro day, I also think that that will help him out. I think Maxwell Hairston probably jumped a few players, potentially like a Darian Porter, who also in his own right had a good day, but I would say that Maxwell Hairston had a bit of a better one. All right, moving on to my stock down, I have unfortunately my Texas boy Gunnar Helm. Now, I do want to throw the caveat that he was performing with a sprained ankle, so maybe that actually helps him, because a lot of teams will see that and be like, hey, this guy's an ultimate competitor. Ultimately though, he really did not have a good performance at the combine, which is unfortunate. Measurables are great: 6'5", 241, 32 3/4 inch arms, 9 7/8 inch hands. Overall, overall looks pretty good, checks out all the boxes there. But his first 40-yard dash, he ran like a 4.9, and then his second one, he ran a 4.84, 1.69 10-yard split, 30-inch vertical jump, 7.15 3-cone drill, and a 4.4-second 20-yard shuttle. Compare that to guys like Shamar Stewart, who are bigger dudes, and Shamar Stewart just absolutely just cleans the plate of Gunnar Helm on this. Now, again, he was performing with what looked to be a sprained ankle. I don't know if I have the picture, but if I do, I'll throw it up right now. The dude went out there and still competed, and I think that ultimately will help him. But you look around the block, and I didn't include him on my personal list here, but Mason Taylor out of LSU, he had a really nice day. And a couple other guys in the tight end room, Terrence Ferguson, he also had a very good day. And you can make the argument now that those guys are both ahead of Gunnar Helm because Gunnar Helm kind of didn't do himself any favors. Listen, this is just my personal opinion, but if I personally think as a prospect that I am a top 5 player within my position, and I know I'm not going to be able to test 100% at the combine, I probably shouldn't compete out there because I think Gunnar Helm's kind of a good example as to why I wouldn't. If I know I can't go out there and compete with the Mason Taylors or Terrence Fergusons out there, whether it's because I'm just not that athletic or because I had an injury, either way, I still think he probably shouldn't have done it. And for Gunnar Helm's sake, I don't think he should have done it. He, for me, was my tight end 3, but arguably now he might be my tight end 5 or 6, depending on, how I feel about Harold Fannin, who also didn't have himself the greatest day ever, but had a better day, arguably. So yeah, Gunnar Helm probably lost himself a bit of money. This was somebody who was probably a day 2 pick, who's now looking a bit more like an early day 3. He could very well still end up as a day 2 pick, depending on how he performs at the pro day. But if he doesn't have the greatest pro day, I'm a little bit concerned about where Gunnar Helm's ultimately going to end up. Moving on to my next stock up candidate, and there were a number of running backs I did consider, but I think the one that did the most for himself was Quinshaw Judkins. He weighed in at 6 foot, 221 pounds, ran a 4.48, 1.51 10-yard split, 38.5 vertical jump, 11-foot broad jump. He ranked second in the athleticism score, which all those things are really good for Quinshaw Judkins, especially when you compare it to Omarion Hampton, who arguably is the better prospect, but there's an argument now that Quinshaw Judkins is just as good of a prospect as like an Omarion Hampton. Obviously, Ashton Genty will likely be the first running back off the board, and I still do believe that Hampton will be the second running back off the board. But now the race for 3, I think, is really interesting. Dylan Sampson had a pretty good day. Caleb Johnson, I thought, looked pretty decent. Travion Henderson, his teammate, also looked good, but I think Quinshaw Judkins might be my new RB3 heading into pro days. Obviously, we'll see how everyone tests and how things look, and we'll obviously keep tracking how things go. But Quinshaw Judkins weighing 220 pounds and running a 4.48, 38.5-inch vertical jump and ranking second on the athleticism score is a really good sign for him. Now, I personally think that Quinshaw Judkins is a fantastic player. Coming into the college football season prior to him joining the Ohio State squad, I had Quinshaw Judkins as my RB1 over Ashton Genty, and then the season happens, Ashton Genty absolutely goes nuts. Quinshaw Judkins has not necessarily a down year, but not as good of a year, and now the pecking order is pretty clear. But for Quinshaw Judkins, he's slowly moving up the board. I wouldn't be shocked if he ends up a first-round pick. I'll just throw that out there. Coming into the day, I thought he was a day 2 guy, but again, I think he arguably is now moving into an early day 2 to potentially a late day 1 pick. All right, my next stock down candidate is going to be Malachi Starks. Now, I don't necessarily think Malachi Starks had a bad day per se. He weighed in at good measurables. I thought he had an okay performance throughout the combine. Ultimately, though, the reason why I have him as a stock down guy is because I kind of think Nick Emanwori might be the new safety 1 in this year's draft class. Like, Malachi Starks was the consensus number 1 safety that was going to come off the board, and he still very well could come off the board number 1 in the safety room. But I think there's now a legitimate argument to be made for Nick Emanwori because Nick Emanwori weighed in at a better size, at least a bigger stature, 220 pounds, 6'3", compared to Malachi Starks, 6'1", 197. And Nick Emanwori was faster. He looked a bit more athletic. Throughout most of the drills, I just thought that Nick Emanwori looked fantastic. Now, again, on the day, Malachi Starks had a fine day, 4.5 40-yard dash, 151 10-yard split, 33-inch vertical jump, 7.26 3-cone drill, and a 4.45 20-yard shuttle. But he ranked 19th on athleticism score while ranking second in production scores. So you just kind of have to debate, do you believe Malachi Starks is just better on the field than he showed at the combine? Again, I don't think he had necessarily a bad day, but compare that to Nick Emanwori, and it's like, yeah, Nick Emanwori looked better at the combine. At the same time, they both kind of play different positions. Malachi Starks is a bit more of a versatile guy who can play strong and free safety, whereas I feel like Nick Emanwori is likely just going to stick at strong safety, so maybe that doesn't drop his stock too much. But again, safety is not a premium position, and you have a day like this where you don't perform at the highest level, and you see a Nick Emanwori who performs at a high level while also having potential versatility to play other positions, and you kind of start to see the reasons as to why Nicky Mawaria is on the rise, whereas Malachi Starks is on the fall. My last stock up candidate for this video, and again, I do want to give the honorable mentions to Matthew Golden and Jahdae Barron. Both guys ran fantastic 40-yard dashes. Jahdae Barron a 4.39, Matthew Golden a 4.29. Both guys were expected to run fast, but maybe not that fast, especially Jahdae Barron, who I thought was a bit more of like a 4.5 guy. Ultimately, let's get back to Armand Membou. Armand Membou came in the day, and I thought he was going to test pretty well, but he tested out of the waters. He ranked 4th in production score, 1st in athleticism score, and 3rd in total score. Ran a 4.91 40-yard dash and just casually bench pressed 31 reps, 34-inch vertical jump, 9'7" broad jump, 6'4", 332 pounds. Compare that to guys like Kelvin Banks, who had a good day, but definitely didn't run a 4.91. A Will Campbell, who also I thought had a pretty good day, but didn't run a 4.91. You know, Josh Simmons didn't perform, and you look at Josh Connerly, who he had a good day too, but Armand Membou was somebody who was seen maybe as the offensive tackle 4 or 3. I think there's a legit argument to be made that he is probably the offensive tackle 1 or 2, depending on what you view Will Campbell being long term. Again, I think Will Campbell likely will stick inside to play guard because he has pretty short arms. Armand Membou very well could be the first pure tackle off the board, again, if you assume that Will Campbell's a guard. Again, you're talking about somebody 6'4", maybe a little bit shorter than what you would like for the tackle position, but still really good size. 6'4", 332 pounds, carries his weight quite nicely, and ran a 4.9. I do want to say that he wasn't the fastest offensive lineman. That was actually Jared Wilson out of Georgia, who his stock is arguably up, so you can also throw him in honorable mentions. But on the day, I mean, Armand Membou was 2nd. Also shout out Jonas Savania running a 4.95. But again, you compare Armand Membou's 4.91 to Ariante Ursary 5.01, Will Campbell 4.98, Josh Connerly 5.05, Kelvin Banks 5.16, Ozzie Trapillo 5.21, Anthony Belton 5.26, Tyler Booker 5.38. So many of these like pretty much consensus top, you know, first couple day picks didn't look as good as, of course, Armand Membou. Armand Membou looks fantastic out there, and again, I think he went from potentially a mid to late first round pick to maybe becoming a top 15 pick. I can definitely see it. You look at a team like Miami, I think they would love to have Armand Membou. So before we get to my last stock down person, I did want to hand out like one dishonorable mention, I suppose, and that was gonna be Mason Graham. The only reason why I didn't include him on this list is because, yes, he didn't measure in with the greatest arm length or the greatest size, but I still think Mason Graham is probably still like a top 5 to top 10 pick. So even if you may consider him a stock down candidate, I don't think it's as bad as a couple other players on this list. Ultimately, my last stock down candidate is going to be another Ohio State Buckeye, Jack Sawyer. Now, Jack Sawyer, he didn't participate in any of the drills, which if it was not injury related, I think that's a bad decision. But if it was injury related or just, you know, wear and tear and just maybe being humble here and just knowing he's not going to compete that well, then maybe I can understand it. But the big thing for Jack Sawyer is you compare him to a lot of the other edge rushers that went out there and put up really good numbers and looked athletic and had really good physical size and statures. Jack Sawyer just didn't quite compete. Now, he's 6'4", 260 pounds. That is a fantastic size for an edge rusher. But he also had 31 3/4 inch arm length, which puts him, and this is the website that I'm reading here, which puts him well inside the bottom 10th percentile among all defensive linemen since 1999. And for the edge rushing position, where you basically have to have long arms in order to have a lot of success in terms of being a pass rusher, for Jack Sawyer, as somebody who doesn't have the greatest bend around the corner, doesn't really have the greatest athleticism, having shorter arms is going to put him at an extreme disadvantage against a lot of offensive tackles out there that do have long arms. For Jack Sawyer, this is somebody who maybe some people had as like a late day 1 pick, early 2nd round pick. I think there's a legit argument to be made that Jack Sawyer now goes in the 3rd or 4th round more so than he goes in the 1st or 2nd round. Now, as a human being and as a competitor, I think that he is the ultimate guy. Like, this guy he breathed Ohio State football, and he was just the ultimate competitor. And there are going to be some teams out there that maybe value that a little bit more than having a little bit of some shorter arms. I mean, Jack Sawyer was also productive at Ohio State, so you do have to take that into account. But you compare that to guys like a Donovan Ezaraku or a Landon Jackson, who both had really, have had really good off seasons so far, and compare that to Jack Sawyer, who hasn't really done himself too much justice, and you sort of start to see the reasons as to why Jack Sawyer is falling down boards a little bit. Again, competitive guy, seems to be a great dude who has a great spirit for the football game, but compare that to other guys around the same position, and those guys are performing better in comparison to a Jack Sawyer. But with all that said, you guys let me know in the comment section below who are your biggest risers and who are your biggest fallers in the upcoming 2025 NFL draft. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button. Love you guys. Peace.